everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
There are some inherently different ways that women leave. And while it's a bell-shaped curve and not every woman has the same trait and not every man doesn't have it, and there's certainly, we don't mean to exclude people who don't identify as a man or a woman. These are traits that are more common but are not exclusive. But women tend to be more collaborative. Women tend to have a different way of assessing risk. They are not averse to risk taking, but they tend to calculate risk differently. Women tend to take the long view more into consideration than short-term gains. And when you put all that together and you add it to a boardroom or to a C-suite, you're going to have a much more robust and fulsome representation in the room.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Ruth Shaber, founder and president of the Terra Health Foundation. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you were an obstetrician and gynecologist at Kaiser for many years. I wonder, how did that experience shape your views, particularly on the need to support innovation and startups, especially in the reproductive health?
Well, I had a wonderful career at Kaiser Permanente, where I was both a clinician, a general OB/GYN, but also I had many different executive roles within the organization. I was the director of women's health. I started a research institute. I worked for the national offices on their general population care programs and evidence-based medicine. And it really taught me what it takes to change very complex systems, what it means to do systems engineering and performance improvement that can be somewhat agnostic to the type of change that you're looking for. So whether it's in healthcare or finance or climate, there's many different things I learned in my career at Kaiser Permanente that are applicable to many other industries.
Well, I'm just going to share things that's pretty well known by a lot of people, which is things like the body mass index, which really uses or references a particular size or height male, white male, which may not necessarily be relevant or applicable for women, for instance, to the fact that women rarely, complain about their health. And they're the ones that actually end up having more severe issues and diseases and implications because they don't complain as much as men. And that's certainly when it comes to reproductive health, specifically in the VC industry that's dominated by white men. This topic and other similarly related topics to women have been overlooked. And I wonder, both the efforts that you've individually have done, but also from a larger kind of mega trend, what are you seeing that is finally bringing some of these things to light and actually doing something about it?
So it's a great question, Scott, and there's a lot of things in there to unpack. I co-wrote the book, The XX Edge, Unlocking Higher Returns and Lower Risk, with the central thesis that when women are able to contribute to financial decision-making across all entities, across all markets, that there's better financial returns and also better social outcomes. So in healthcare, that means that when new medicines are being conceived of or new products or services are being designed, if you're not taking into account how women are going to utilize those products, or in the case of body mass index, if you're not thinking about how does a woman's body different than a man's, and when you're creating these standards and ways of measurement, that if you don't take into consideration half the population, that you're going to miss a huge opportunity. And in healthcare particularly, and this was really important, something I learned early on in my medical career, is that women tend to make most of the healthcare decisions, not just for themselves, but for their families. So if you're designing products and services, if you're a company, whether you're a pharmaceutical company or some new platform for distribution, whatever, or cosmetic surgery, or whether it's core medical care or more elective care, if you're not taking into consideration how women are going to perceive and consume and decide about your products and services, then you're gonna miss a huge opportunity for your market.
Well, you shared a lot of facts there. We're going to probably need to unpack it gradually here throughout the interview. But certainly, there's a lot of studies that have shown that are focused on women, but also just diversity overall, especially in leadership, and how that actually helps with better decision-making outcomes. Because instead of convergence, we are able to create divergent thinking. And to your point, the different experiences, perspective of women are going to add to that diversity, and effectively the process of decision making improves as a result. Now, before we go further, let's first talk a little bit about Tara Health Foundation. If you could explain, please.
Yeah, so in 2014, I had the opportunity to start this foundation, Tara Health Foundation, and my intention was to include all that I had learned in my career in medicine and bring it to bear in philanthropy, and not just in how we think about our grant making at Tara Health Foundation, but how we do our investing. And one of the things that I'm most proud of about the foundation is that we use 100% of our assets to work towards our mission, which means that we don't just give away money for our grants. We actually think very, very rigorously about our investment portfolio. So whether it's private markets, public equity, fixed income, real estate, we have a lending program across the board. We use all of our capital for our social purpose, which is women and girls. And we do focus mainly on the United States. We have a particular interest in reproductive health, but also in women in the workplace, corporate engagement, and improving the science of impact investing. So those are our core programs. And we both give away grant money, but we also invest and we build the field of impact investing with our grant dollars.
So thank you for that overview. And I wonder if you could share maybe a case study or two specifically around some of those subcategories that you mentioned and how you're helping with some of these impact investing aspects.
Well, a really good example would be in the field of reproductive health. So women's clinics across the country that may be providing comprehensive women's health care, which includes maternal health care, contraception, in some cases abortion care. With all of the fluctuations in the legal climate and the social and legal stigma that may be placed on opening and closing clinics, one healthcare chain, in particular, Whole Women's Health, was tremendously burdened with legal fees, and they had run up a huge amount of debt that was basically on their credit cards. So about 6 years ago, they were finding that this was a huge barrier to their operations, and they were otherwise a sustainable enterprise and were easily making their, supporting the business. We were able to refinance their debt with a much more favorable loan. At the same time, we often supported them with grant money. So that's just one example of where we used the right type of capital to solve the particular problem that they needed. They didn't just want philanthropic dollars and grant money. They wanted to be able to support their business sustainably, and that meant having a competitive and relatively low interest loan that they had no problem paying back. So that's one example. That's
interesting, and you've actually created different types of structure finance products to support that.
That's right. And one of the examples that I'm extremely proud of is we incubated and then launched an enterprise called Rhia Ventures, which started out as the Reproductive Health Investors Alliance. And this is a private equity, essentially venture capital fund that looks for early stage companies in the contraception and maternal health space that historically have been tremendously underfunded and undercapitalized in industry. And this is another thing that we bring up in the book, the XX Edge, that even though contraception and the ability for women and families to plan their number of children they want to have is so fundamental to business and to the working of our markets. And yet there's been no innovation in the contraception space in 70, 80 years. And so to be able to bring more capital, to capitalize more capital using a pretty standard conventional tool like venture capital but to bring it to companies that otherwise don't have access to that capital is something that's really making a difference and hopefully is going to result in some really interesting new innovations in the space.
Well, I'm very excited to hear that. I really am. And it's amazing how outdated those sectors are. And it really needs a new infusion of capital. Now, there's an elephant in the room that we have to talk about. And again, maybe you weren't anticipating is the potential overturning of Roe versus Wade. And I wonder how that's going to really have a huge implication and really a reversal in terms of women's movement and really all the things that we're talking about and potentially even the representation at the work, leadership, and the board level.
Well, Scott, the reality is that women have had terrible access to reproductive health, particularly abortion care in this country for a long time. And so while the overturning of Roe v. Wade is going to be very dramatic and it's going to get a lot of people's attention, the reality has been for many women in many states that there's only one provider or two providers, that they have to travel hundreds of miles to get care. So this is not an elephant in the room for those of us in this field. It's been going on a long time. But the reality of the impact on business in particular and the economies of the states that choose to make abortion illegal, once Roe v. Wade is gone, it'll revert to the states. And it's going to destabilize workforces. And one more thing that we talk about in the book is that women are an essential part of the workforce, and particularly at leadership levels. And we know from surveys that we've been doing that both men and women don't want to move to a state. They're not going to be recruited to work for a company where they don't have access to full healthcare services. And that companies that are thinking of relocating, I know many, there's favorable tax structures in Texas, for instance, that it's really going to destabilize their workforce. And they're going to find that women aren't going to be happy and men aren't going to be happy if they're also in a reproductive age range. So we know from looking at the business case that having full services healthcare, which includes access to abortion, is a business imperative for companies that expect to hire and maintain a healthy workforce that includes reproductive age women.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I think the real issue is criminalization. So, anyone that's aiding, helping, including corporations, employers, service providers, could also get pulled into it as well. So there's a huge legal ramifications that are yet to be really determined, right?
That's right. And we certainly can look to many other countries in Latin America, for instance, where abortion has been criminalized. And it is really devastating to the healthcare systems and obviously to families and communities.
Yeah. So going back to women in leadership, many corporations have been touting diversity inclusion. And I wonder, do you feel that we're making enough progress in inclusivity of women in leadership, or is really much of it more like marketing, kind of like what we're seeing with, many other movements? We
are not making enough progress. And you're right that folks like to talk about it, but is it really actually changing? The numbers are still really dramatic that, for instance, in my field in healthcare, women make up 75, 85% of the healthcare workforce, not just in the United States, but around the world, but represent less than 25% of leadership in the industry. And that includes healthcare delivery systems, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies. And that mismatch is a huge missed opportunity that when you are able to bring that diversity in leadership, especially when you're representing your consumers and your workforce, you're going to get better products. And whether you're talking about gender diversity or racial diversity or other types of diversity, when there's more representation in the room, when you have the different lived experiences and the different traits. One of the things that we talk about in the book is there are some inherently different ways that women lead. And while it's a bell-shaped curve and not every woman has the same trait and not every man doesn't have it, and there's certainly, we don't mean to exclude people who don't identify as a man or a woman. These are traits that are more common but are not exclusive. But women tend to be more collaborative. Women tend to have a different way of assessing risk. They are not averse to risk taking, but they tend to calculate risk differently. Women tend to take the long view more into consideration than short-term gains. And when you put all that together and you add it to a boardroom or to a C-suite, you're going to have a much more robust and fulsome representation in the room. And there's also an interesting contextual thing that I want to make sure to stress is that when you're only taking the top 5% of talent of any demographic, so in the case of women, whether it's in a fund manager, venture capital fund, or in the Fortune 500 companies as the CEOs or in the C-suite, if you're only taking the top 1 to 5% of talent, you're leaving out of the room 45% of above average talent. That just, if you just look at those numbers, if you're skimming off the top of of a talent pool, that you're missing opportunities. And the other contextual thing to consider is that in many cases, women are the ones who are closest to the problems that need to be solved. So whether it's in healthcare or climate change, which I know is something that you and your listeners really care about, women are the ones who are most impacted by food insecurity or extreme weather events or climate migration. And so when you pull them in and make sure that they're central to the innovation and financial decision-making in those areas, you're going to get solutions that are more likely to stick and more likely to be sustainable.
Yep, excellent points. Couldn't agree with you more on that. One of the things that I think that I've heard over the years is the structure, the methodology by which women move up. Right. So, people usually look at the board level and the CXO level, but the reality is it starts much earlier. It's at the manager and senior manager level. And when you don't have enough pool of women, the next rung up, they're not going to have an eligible pool. And of course, the often excuse that you hear from hiring managers, let's say for director level, is that there's not enough pool of female in the senior manager level. And then when they look down, they don't have enough pool of women under manager level. So as you kind of filter up to the top, the women becomes less and less and less. And then you create this structure where, people say, well, we just don't have enough eligible women that fits that role. How do we start to correct this really fundamental organizational issue that I'm talking about?
You describe it really well, Scott, that it's not, and you can't just snap your fingers and expect these sorts of, decades, centuries long problems to just go away. That it is a real thing that the number of women who are available to be promoted in a company may be less than what you would want if you're trying to have a real inclusive senior management or executive management team. But it takes real intention. It takes things like making sure that even at the lower levels, that you're promoting, that you're giving access to promotion to all people, not just the ones who volunteer, because we know that women are less likely to volunteer for promotions for whatever reason. So you need to reach out and make sure that you're looking at all the talent. There needs to be more robust sense of mentorship. That we can't go on, I was a senior executive at my company, and our tendency is to mentor people who look just like us. And that's where we're comfortable. Those are the people we know. But when you start becoming intentional about reaching out to people who don't look like you, whether a different gender or a different race or different disabilities or different age, that we find that you're not only going to be, is it a win-win because you're giving the opportunities to the person you're mentoring, but the senior person also has the opportunity to learn and grow. So mentorship across demographics is essential. And recruiting, that when we start to think about what does it take to recruit a gender diverse workforce, we have to make sure that the policies and the benefits packages and the incentives to come work for a company, and that goes back to not working in a state where you can't get adequate health care. Yeah. Really are important. So there's a lot of intermediate steps that need to happen before we can really get to real gender inclusion. But it takes intention. You have to think about it. It doesn't just happen. The talented workforce doesn't just walk across your threshold. You have to go out and look for them.
So one of the things that, I think we've seen anecdotally quite a bit is token diversity. So maybe a large blue chip company will have a female on the board. It's single female out of all the men, and their reaction is that, hey, we're good. We're good because we're representing. I wonder if that creates the false sense of security and readiness. And we talked about some really grassroots, some really difficult organizational development changes, and it stops it in its tracks because of this token diversity aspect. And then the other thing I think you start to kind of allude to is we are starting to see more female representation on the board and CXO level, but they tend to be white women. So right. the black women, other women of color are not necessarily represented.
You're absolutely right. And one thing that I can say that I think we all know is that when you're bringing people from an otherwise historically underrepresented group to your leadership, whether it's in a board or an executive suite or fund managers, that you can't just have one. You can't just check a box and say if you have one person of that type that you're going to be getting that representation. It doesn't work that way. And in my field in OBGYN, and certainly in my work at the foundation, we almost always have all women in our groups on a Zoom call and a big meeting across different organizations. And so we have the opposite problem of trying to recruit men to join us. And it's we try and follow the same rule. You can't just have one and expect to have that male point of view represented. And the studies show that it's probably three, that when you have three people of whatever it is you're trying to diversify to, that you're more likely to have their point of view really represented, and that's what gives folks the comfort to speak up and really address whatever issues on the table. And the other thing that's necessary is whether you have one or three or half of your group is women or of another diverse element, you have to listen. You have to actually be intentional about listening. You have to make physical space and that listening space to hear what they have to say.
And I think what you're referring to, and I wonder if it falls within gender analysis, and certainly you also reference some studies as well. There's actually a lot of studies. And one of the studies to me that I personally read as well is just there's so much empirical evidence. So you would think that shareholders, activists, investors would see that there is actually significant growth in companies from a profit as well as stock value and accumulation under female CFOs compared to their male predecessors. And I wonder why they overlook that. And if you truly are a shareholder, you want to profit maximize, and the facts are kind of pretty clear, right?
They are crystal clear. And I'm laughing because in my career in medicine, where the field of evidence-based medicine has been around much longer than any kind of scientific investment, field, we found out in the 90s, and a very famous article that was published in the Journal of American Medicine that showed that the time lag between when convincing science is published, between when it's and when it's universally implemented, is on average 17 years. So people are really slow to change. And even when the evidence is right there, staring them in the face, and it's obvious. And one of the reasons we wrote this book was to try and make the case and describing it as an XX edge, that this is a way to get a jump on the industry, to that it's a leadership opportunity to bring women into your financial decision making, and you're going to make more money and you're going to have the social impact that we all crave. Thinking that maybe that's a way to make the case for following the science. The science is really clear. You're absolutely right.
So let's transition to talk about climate change and broader ESG. And you mentioned before, the things that deals with food safety and security, as well as masses of movements, migration, and so forth. All of these things really disproportionately affects women, and particularly mothers that are caring for their children and their families. If you could talk about the importance of female representation, both from a leadership as well as just overall representation, and why it's so critical for us to actually have that tipping point around climate action.
Well, I think you can think about the climate leadership both at the micro level and at the macro level. So in the micro level, you mentioned that women are the ones who are impacted the most by food insecurity and extreme weather events, climate migration, and whether it's for themselves or caring for their families. And they are the ones who tend, whether it's finding alternative water sources or identifying the most effective new farming techniques for subsistence farmers in Africa. Women are the ones who are more likely to have the innovative solutions, but they also tend to be under-resourced. So some really interesting data shows that women do more for less with less. So if we're worried about being able to feed the continent of Africa, for instance, and how is it that we're going to adapt to drought and lack of water, then women need to be at the community level and all the way up to the government level to helping to make those decisions and innovate and come up with the new solutions. Then more at the macro level, certainly around what can businesses do. Women are much more likely when they're in a leadership role at a company, they're much more likely to, even if they have in an industry that has nothing to do with the environment or climate or energy, they're more likely to recommend the environmental changes at their company that are going to have a positive environmental impact, more sustainability impact. Women really were the earliest founders of the ESG movement. Now it's becoming mainstream, but women are much more likely to recommend investments. If female financial advisors are the more likely to bring up the opportunity to invest with a climate lens to their clients, even if their clients don't ask for it. So across systems, having women centralized in decision making is going to have a positive impact on mitigating the impact of climate change.
Well, as a closing thought is that bringing it back more closer to home in the U.S. is that women play a very critical role. So oftentimes they're the ones that's doing bulk of the retail as well as grocery shopping, and they're the ones that's making a decision around, hey, do we get this hamburger or do we, consider maybe an alternative meat or maybe even plant-based meat, Impossible Burgers, whatever it is, to even the vehicles that they drive. Do we need to consider electric vehicles versus the traditional combustion engines, composting versus just throwing away the waste? So you're absolutely right, and I really wish that the conversation and the topics that we're discussing today really has gravitas and it really takes a hold, and that it goes beyond just, this broader kind of greenwashing and marketing is what I call it, to something more tangible.
One point, Scott, that we didn't really talk about is that this isn't a zero-sum game.
Yes.
That bringing women into financial decision-making doesn't mean that they're replacing men. It means that you're actually making more room at the table. And we know there's so much data now that shows that when you do that, the opportunities actually grow. You actually grow the pie. It's not everyone gets one slice. That when you're inclusive and you bring in diversity into your teams, the pie gets bigger for everybody.
I love it. I love it. So with that, I have been joined by Dr. Ruth Shaber, president of the Taro Health Foundation. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.